If you haven't already rated and reviewed the Single Tracks podcast in your podcast app, now's the time to do it. We're randomly selecting listener reviews to read on the show, and if we choose yours, you'll get a free Single Tracks hat in the mail. Hit pause right now, write a quick review, and then listen to future episodes to find out if you won yourself a hat. Happy trails. Hey everybody, welcome to the Single Tracks podcast. My name is Jeff, and today my guest is Douglas Carchrie. Douglas is a bicycle mechanic, mountain bike guide, and mountain bike trail consultant at Big Mountain, Scotland. He's also served as a national park conservation intern, and he conducted research into mountain bike behavior as a student at University of Highlands and Islands in Scotland. Thanks for joining us, Douglas.
Thanks for having me.
So how long have you been mountain biking?
So I've been mountain biking for around about 7 years. It's something I've always sort of done, but I got competitive in it when I was around about 7. Did a bit of cross country racing and enduro and stuff. So yeah, I've done a bit. Yeah, just so happened that we were passing by a venue that there was a race on, and they still had entries, and my brother wanted to try it, so I did too. He kind of dragged me into it, and I've stuck at it.
Wow, that's incredible. What kind of bike were you riding? What's a competitive mountain bike for a 7-year-old?
Oh, it's pretty bad, but it was a 24-inch wheeled Ridgeback. It was a kind of entry-level mountain bike. I probably had the heaviest bike there. I think I was 6 out of 8 kids, but it got me hooked.
Yeah, right on. That's cool. So did your interest in mountain biking influence your selection of coursework at university?
Yeah, definitely. I've always kind of been interested in the outdoors and the environment. And yeah, through mountain biking and various outdoor pursuits, I was just interested in seeing how the outdoor world worked more. So geography was a natural progression for me of understanding the outdoor world and seeing how I could link, sport as well as conservation together.
Yeah. Was mountain biking for you like a way to get outside? Like, what did you enjoy most about mountain biking? Was it the racing and competing, or was it, just being able to get outdoors and access scenery and that kind of thing?
I'd say that the racing was probably a catalyst for actually getting me out. But yeah, I definitely, looking back, I kind of enjoy just getting out there and getting outside and, seeing what Scotland has to offer. So yeah, it definitely got me out there. And yeah, still, it's probably the main reason that I ride.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily about the adrenaline, although that's there. It's not the be all and end all for me.
Yeah. Well, as a student, you wrote a thesis investigating mountain bikers' levels of awareness about a particular conservation issue. So give us an overview of the study. So
the purpose of the study was to identify whether local mountain bikers or visiting mountain bikers were more aware of a species of bird called Capercaillie in the Cairngorms National Park, and looking at how willing both visitors and local mountain bikers would be to change their behavior, basically to benefit that particular species.
Okay.
And also looking at the best way to communicate with the mountain bike community and making sure that they have best information possible. So it was kind of linking mountain biking and conservation, and seeing how we can bridge the gap between the two.
Yeah. Well, did you, as part of your study, were you only looking at mountain bikers, or were you looking at all trail users and kind of seeing how aware they were of this conservation issue?
So it was primarily mountain bikers. There's been a bit of work with other user groups in Scotland, but mountain bikers kind of have been left out a little bit. Generally, they're sort of viewed as quite a hard group of people to approach. So there have been various studies done, and they don't quite capture the mountain bike community right. Just simple things like branding trail riders as downhill mountain bikers, and just little things like that. They don't necessarily get the mountain bike world. Then we're not we don't have like a collective group in Scotland of, we are the mountain bike society, whereas with walking and climbing and various other outdoor pursuits, there's a sort of big governing body that you can communicate with and get through to a lot of these other user groups. So they've been well studied, but mountain bikers have kind of been left out a little bit. So I kind of wanted to get in there and show that, we can communicate with mountain bikers and it's not very difficult. You just kind of have to know how to approach them.
Well, do you think it's a matter of mountain bikers not being approachable one-on-one, or is it more of what you're saying is just that they're not as organized, and so you can't go to the head mountain biker and say, hey, we want to talk to your people? Or do you think people are, I don't know, do they see mountain bikers as more aggressive or more difficult just to even talk to?
Yeah, so a lot of the studies I looked at sort of branded mountain bikers as rebels almost. We're not a typical outdoor user group in Scotland. In Scotland, it's quite traditional. There's lots of people that are into hill walking, just walking around forests as families. Climbing has got quite a strong heritage here. So do paddle sports and lots of water sports and things, and even trail running. But mountain bikers are kind of, we're fairly new. It's only really taken off in Scotland in the last sort of 20 years with the access rights that we were granted in 2003. Basically allowed mountain biking to take off, and the way that mountain bikers move as well, we tend to move quite quickly. People wear really bright colors. The current sort of enduro culture as well maybe doesn't help things with the way that we speak to one another and shouting on trails and things like that. So we can be seen as quite rowdy or potentially aggressive, but actually you'll know yourself that mountain bikers are really nice people. There's maybe one or two that ruin it for people, but generally, if you stop and chat to somebody, they're more than happy to have a conversation with you. And I think it's just people don't necessarily realize that. So that's why I was so keen as a mountain biker to kind of show, although we do like, riding through the woods and doing kind of stupid stuff now and again, we are interested in the outdoors and the environment.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, it's something we don't really think about too, kind of that social aspect of it. And just how we're perceived, I mean, think about it now, like you're wearing a helmet. I mean, if you're wearing a full face helmet and you've got goggles on and you're on a bike, so you're kind of like at a higher level than the people you're encountering on the trail, I could see how that could be kind of not scary, but there does seem to be that like separation between like us and them, and people being kind of wary about talking to mountain bikers.
Yeah, definitely. It's unfortunate, and I think we're kind of breaking through it now in Scotland anyway, sort of bridging the gap, even if it is just chatting to people at the side of a trail, whether they're walking up and you're riding down, and rather than just flying past them, stopping and saying, oh, it's a beautiful day, where are you heading? What's the trail like down here? Because a lot of what we have in Scotland is multi-use paths. We're free to ride walking paths. Walkers are free to ride mountain bike trails if they like, or walk mountain bike trails. There's nothing stopping either group from doing that. So you do quite often come across somebody else on the trail that isn't necessarily a mountain biker. So you do kind of have to be careful and conscious of how you're coming across as a mountain biker, not to be aggressive or, as I say, just riding past people without even looking at them. So yeah, we do still have a way to go, but mountain bikers can definitely be perceived as a bit out there and not the more traditional user groups certainly in Scotland.
Well, let's talk about this bird, this endangered bird, the Capercaillie. It's, from my understanding, it's a rather large bird. It's like a turkey, for our listeners who know what a turkey is. So what's so special about this bird, and why is it endangered?
Yeah, so the Capercaillie it's only really in Europe that you find them. It's sort of known as being a Western European species. And yeah, they grow to around about 80 centimeters tall and around about 4 kilograms. So they're quite big for a bird. It's part of the grouse family. So that maybe brings it into perspective for some of your listeners in America. But yeah, they've not had an easy life in Scotland. They went extinct in Britain in the 18th century, were reintroduced in the 1830s. And then since they were reintroduced, they flourished. They did really, really well. And then it's just gone downhill. And that is kind of been put down to habitat loss. So, deforestation. And that has basically meant that the populations that were there have kind of been split apart and confined to their individual woodlands. So, and then these are generally commercial forests as well. So they can experience habitat loss and things like that. And then as more people have sort of moved into the Highlands, especially in the Cairngorms, as it's become a national park, it's become quite a popular place to move to and live. We've seen lots of people moving into quite close proximity to these woodlands, and that's not made the Capercaillie's life any easier. So there's the Cairngorms, which is the area that I study, just is home to around about 80% of Scotland's Capercaillie population, and there's only between 1,000 and 2,000 Capercaillie left.
Oh wow!
So there's in Scotland, there's some elsewhere in Europe, but yeah, certainly in Scotland, there's not a lot. And the kind of issue with mountain bikers is we favour the same sort of habitat as Capercaillie do. Kind of ironically, yeah, it's a funny one. And yeah, as I say, these forests that we like riding in are also home to the Capercaillie and are really close to where a lot of people are living, so they become places that people build trails in ultimately, and that can have a negative implication for the Capercaillie.
Yeah. Have you seen a Capercaillie in the wild?
Yeah, so I've seen quite a few, even mostly just when out mountain biking, not even looking for them. You'll just turn a corner and spot one. Okay.
So it's pretty common for mountain bikers to see them when they're riding in that area?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's common. If you chat to anybody that lives there and rides, they'll have seen one. But generally, people that are visiting either won't know what it is because the females look quite similar to some other birds that we have in Scotland, or they'll spot one and be super happy about it. But yeah, it's kind of not a lot of people know about them that are visiting. So the locals know a lot about them, and I've seen them all the time. And visitors, might have seen one but wouldn't know what it was.
Yeah. Are these birds mostly stick to the ground? I mean, I'm imagining like a large bird not doing a lot of flying around. Like, are they ground based, or they have nests in trees? Where do you usually see them?
Yeah, so they're generally ground based. They roost in trees, so they'll have a perch somewhere that they like to sit on, but it's not like a big nest, and you won't see one flying through the sky. If you see one flying, it'll be at head height through a forest. So you're unlikely to see them flying. It's generally on the ground and going the opposite direction from you because they've had a scare.
Well, your study focused primarily on mountain bikers. So I want to ask you, do mountain bikers tend to bother animals more than other trail users, or is it about the same for like hikers or people on horses or things like that?
So it varies. Certainly with Capercaillie, they don't necessarily disturb them as much as other users. It's thought that other forest users, such as dog walkers, probably cause the biggest disturbance, with dogs off leads running through the forest, and people walking or moving quite slowly. Whereas mountain bikers, who move quite quickly through the forest, they might, scare that animal initially, but actually because they're gone, they're gone reasonably quickly. Things can then kind of return to normal, rather than that person walking. It takes quite a long time to move out with the area. But the biggest issue that mountain bikers have is how far we can travel. So we can travel really deep into the forest onto trails that maybe get used once a week. So that's when we kind of start to see issues, is on these trails that are further into the forest, which is kind of where species like Capercaillie are inhabiting, away from people. So they're kind of more used to people on regularly used trails, but it's on these sort of trails that are deep in the forest that they have issues, because they're not expecting anything, basically. So it's that's kind of that's where mountain bikers pose an issue.
So what are some of the things that mountain bikers have been asked to do to avoid disturbing the Capercaillies?
So at the moment, mountain bikers haven't been asked to do anything specific. So there's a few sites in the Cairngorms that there's signs up that say, all forest users, please stick to the trails during breeding season for Capercaillie, which is April to August. So we're not being told not to ride. We're kind of being told, stick to the trails. If you've got a dog, keep it on the trail. Don't let it run off into the forest and potentially disturb something. It is about, sticking to these well-used trails. And yes, with our outdoor access laws in Scotland, we can't really be told not to ride trails. It kind of prevents any sort of blanket bans. There are some instances that people are told, this is a sensitive environmental area. You can't really come in here. But yeah, with our outdoor access laws, that's not happened yet with Capercaillie.
So I'm curious to know how unofficial trails play a role in this. I imagine that the established trails are generally going to be routed to sort of minimize wildlife impact. Did you find in your survey and in your study that a lot of mountain bikers were using unofficial trails within the park? And what's the impact of that?
Yeah, so I had 2 study sites in the Cairngorms, which were quite close to one of the bigger towns, which is quite popular with tourists, called Aviemore. And within those 2 sites, all of the trails are unofficial. We don't have any official trails. Oh. So in the past, there had been plans to build official trails in the area, but then due to the Capercaillie, they were moved elsewhere. So they were moved further away out with the area. So I'd say majority of the trails are unofficial, but they're very well utilized. So they're well used by not only mountain bikers, they're used by dog walkers, runners, and everything in between. So there's, they're well established. They've been there for a long time. So it's not necessarily about the trails being unofficial. It's, the creating of new trails that becomes an issue. Although the building of trails doesn't necessarily have a negative impact unless they're built badly or in a fragile environment. But thankfully, the area has a pretty good trail association that are kind of upkeeping the trails themselves, and making sure that people aren't building new stuff that is going to be, put everything at risk, basically.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like as part of your study, you looked at whether local riders were more aware of conservation issues than those who visit from other areas. The spot where you're doing your study is people travel from all over to ride some of these trails. So did you find a difference between sort of awareness between those 2 groups? Yeah.
So over 60% of the local riders were aware of Capercaillie and conservation issues, whereas only around about 40% of the visiting riders were. So there's a big difference for the people that are riding there regularly than those that are traveling to visit.
So did you find that local riders were more receptive to hearing about the Capercaillies than people who are from out of town? Sometimes there's this assumption that maybe riders from out of town don't care as much about the trails because they figure these, I don't live here. I'm not here all the time. And so it doesn't really matter to me. And maybe even the rules don't apply to me as much. Did you find that in talking with the out of town riders?
Only a little bit. So when looking at the data, 80% of local riders were kind of more than happy to do something and even stop riding in an area during Capercaillie breeding season to help the species, whereas it was 70% of people that were coming in. So it's a tiny difference really when you look at interviewing or speaking to hundreds of different people. So I think it's pretty universal in Scotland. We kind of, although we might travel for a few hours to go and ride somewhere else, it's still not really that far away. And if you do something wrong on that trail, or you go out there and you're disturbing species or making a bad name for mountain biking, everybody's going to know about it. People are going to know that you've traveled from this area or traveled into the area. So it's quite a holistic community, I'd like to think. People are generally all for supporting trails, regardless of whether they're in the area or not. And that extends to the environment, I think.
Yeah. Well, you said that it sounded like local riders, just over half of them were aware of the Capercaillies, but then also most of them, 80%, were willing to change their behavior to have less of an impact. So how do you go about educating more people to get people, from 60% awareness to close to 100%? Are there methods that you found or that you think might be more effective when it comes to communicating information like this to trail users?
Yeah, so I kind of asked people what their ideal form of communication is. And for a lot of people, it was really basic things like signage and information boards at trailheads, in car parks, and on the trails themselves. So not everybody's on social media. So having something physical that is really hard to miss at the entrance to the trail that says, if you could not ride this trail today, that would be great. People are going to do it because they don't have to think. They don't have to go and do research. They don't necessarily have to read my research paper, which is however many thousand words long and takes an hour to read. They can just show up and go, right, okay, let's not ride that trail today. No problem. Mm-hmm. But people also, we're quite keen on social media stuff. I think it's got a really big part to play. We've got these riders and influencers that are promoting brands and products. Why can't they also promote conservation information? It's not difficult, really. They have thousands of followers that are all manner of mountain bikers. It's not just high level people or entry level folk. It's everybody that these social media influencers are accessing. So there's definitely some work can be done there. But I also kind of found there is a need for more articles and videos and blogs and things about conservation. Because there is riders that want to learn more and understand why they maybe shouldn't be riding that trail at that time of year, and really dive into it. And that is great because these are the people that are going to pass that information on to others. So yeah, there's a need for a little bit of everything, even to the extent of things like workshops and guided rides and stuff for more from local people than those that are visiting, just so the locals can really get to grips and see what's going on as well as reading about it.
Yeah. Well, I find it interesting too. I mean, you say that signage helps, but even within signage, it's like how do you communicate that? How do you say it? And your example of a sign that says it would be good if you maybe didn't ride today, is much different than saying like, do not ride. Like you will, there will be a massive fine and you will be taken to jail if you ride here today. So, I mean, was that part of what you looked at, like how you communicate that and sort of if people are more receptive to sort of a nice message versus, one that's very direct?
It wasn't something I looked at specifically, but I definitely sort of found that people generally take to sort of more polite messages better. You know, with that sort of almost rebellious streak of mountain bikers. If you say don't ride there, they're going to go and ride there.
Right.
You know, there's always going to be that percentage of the community that does that. Unfortunately. So from what I've seen, it tends to be that sort of middle ground. It's not necessarily saying, please don't ride this trail. It's kind of, you know, as I say, could you not ride this trail at this time of year? Ride it any other time of year. That's absolutely fine. You know, come December, do laps of it for all weekend.
Right.
But within these couple of months, it'd be great if you didn't ride it.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's definitely a happy medium. I don't think anybody's going to put up signs saying, do not ride here, you'll be fined, because that's just going to create backlash.
Yeah.
People aren't going to be happy.
Right. And
so yeah, it is about educating people rather than punishing them.
Yeah, that's a good point about education too. And again, the message is just, you know, I mean, again, you could say, just please don't ride here, and then nobody knows why, right? But if you're giving them more information and saying, because there's this, you know, endangered species that's here and you might disturb it. And so, you know, we would appreciate it and the birds would appreciate it if you don't ride this time of year. It seems like people, when they have more information like that, they can make better decisions. And it sounds like a lot of times they're willing to make the right decision.
Yeah, absolutely. If people realize it's not just whoever owns the land that just doesn't want somebody mountain biking there, that there is something greater, and, you know, by not riding these trails, you're kind of protecting the environment and preserving the place that you like to ride so much, and making it so that these trails are going to last longer and it's going to be accessible for future generations. I think people are more susceptible when they kind of understand that it is more than just humans. There is more going on. It's not just about us riding bikes. You have to think about the implications of it.
Yeah. Well, there are obviously a number of different tools available to land managers, including enforcement and trail design, and then obviously education. So which one do you think provides the biggest impact in terms of, you know, modifying trail user behavior? Is it education, or, you know, if you were able to start from scratch and maybe design the trail in a way that you're going to minimize those impacts, like, is that better, or do you think ultimately education is the best way?
I think there's kind of a combination. As you say, if we had a fresh bit of forest that we were told to go and build trails, then trail design can go a long way. It can prevent a lot of problems. Spent a bit of time in Canada on the West Coast and seeing how effective trail design can go a long way. So basic things like, you know, zoning trails so that mountain bikers are kept away from sensitive areas, or even keeping user groups apart so hikers and mountain bikers aren't on the same trails coming into conflict. You know, it can go a long way. But ultimately, in Scotland, we're in the position that the trails are already here, and we kind of have to work backwards a little bit. So education definitely comes into play. So educating people is the best solution for here. It doesn't work everywhere. There are some places that ultimately they'll probably have to close trails and start again. And we've kind of seen that already in Scotland, where some trails have been closed off, and they said, right guys, this is enough. We kind of need to, you know, we've got so many other trails that are close by, you know, we can lose a couple. And that's unfortunate. But if these people were educated from the start, or there was something else in place, then you wouldn't have those issues. But yeah, ultimately, if people understand that there is implications from mountain biking and there are consequences environmentally from doing things badly, then, you know, you don't have these problems that come along down the road. So yeah, education is probably top of my priority list in terms of things we can do at the moment.
Yeah. Does enforcement play a role at all? I know here in the U.S., you know, I mean, there just aren't a lot of land managers or rangers or people who are going to be out sort of watching bikers and hikers and making sure they're following all the rules and, you know, being sensitive to wildlife and things like that. But does it play a role at all? Like, I don't know, if you were able to enforce the rule and make an example out of people, we see that every now and then. Do you think that is effective, or again, does it come back to education?
I think it's effective in some situations. I think there are times that maybe somebody does need to be made an example of, but I'd only really like to see that after education has happened. You know, if somebody has been educated and, you know, don't build a trail here because you're going to damage the environment, you're going to make things worse for everybody, and then they go and do it, fair enough.
Yeah.
There's then a need for somebody to step in and go, hand them with a fine or whatever.
Yeah.
whatever needs to be done. But I personally see that as a sort of last resort. We shouldn't jump to enforcement straight away. But ultimately, there is that little bit that, you know, there maybe is a need for people watching what's going on as well. There is maybe the need for rangers that understand mountain biking and understand mountain bike trails, so that when something new is popping up, they can step in straight away and say, we're going to have to stop this right now. We can't have a trail built here. So having that there from the start, yeah, again, it could make a big difference. But as I say, I'd like to see sort of education being top of the priority list rather than enforcement, because ultimately enforcement can create conflict, whereas education is quite, you know, it's quite accessible, really. So yeah, I'd like to see enforcement as a last resort.
Yeah, you make a good point that education should come before enforcement. I mean, if you don't know the rules, then I mean that's no excuse. I'm sure you can argue that in court all day long, and you know still get the book thrown at you. But for mountain biking, there's just so many people joining the sport all the time, especially right now, who they just don't know any better. They're new. There's a lot to learn with mountain biking, as most of us know, you know, in terms of like fitness and learning how to ride technical trails and your gear. And I mean, there's just so much to learn. And so sometimes environmental stuff, maybe that's not going to be the first thing you learn. Trail etiquette, there's a learning curve to that as well. And so, yeah, it only seems fair that you really focus on that end and not worry so much about, you know, trying to enforce the rules that maybe a lot of people aren't even aware of.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Well, you're also a mountain bike guide and director for Big Mountain Scotland. What are some of the best places to ride there?
So I'm probably slightly biased on this. My favorite trails at the moment are in Dunkeld, which is where I grew up and where I'm currently living, and where my business is based as well. We've got a lot of variety here. We've got lots of super rocky, rooty, muddy, horrible trails that are just amazing at this time of year, when they're covered in water, and yeah, it's a great time for everyone. But there's also a lot of sort of fast flowy trails that are accessible for kids, which is great. We've seen more of that being built, and you know, looking at how much use they get, it's great. Especially as you say, with more people coming in into the mountain bike community. Although we don't really have a lot of jumps in this part of the world, we don't do big gap jumps and things. They tend to get torn down pretty quickly. But I guess the trails in the Cairngorms that I studied and you know rode for 3 years whilst I was studying in Inverness will probably be the close second. It's an amazing place to ride. The ability to ride a sort of rocky mountaintop descent and then go into the woods at the bottom and finish the day with some laps of techie, rooty, rocky trails that are loamy and fast, and then go to the pub without having to drive anywhere, is awesome. It's unreal. It's an amazing part of the world. I highly recommend to anyone visiting Scotland to check out the Cairngorms, as well as all the sort of more popular places. There's a lot more riding in Scotland than people realise, and hopefully once restrictions allow, I'll be able to show some clients what Scotland has to offer and hopefully educate them about the environment on the way. Yeah.
Do you think that knowing about the environment enhances the ride for people? I mean, it sounds like it does for you personally. Do you think other people feel the same way?
Yeah, definitely. I think if people kind of understand what is going on a bit more, and if that person sees a Capercaillie on their own, they're maybe not going to think twice, just think, oh, there's a bird. But if you tell them that there's only 1,000, 2,000 of those left, and they've just seen one, they're going to be hopefully pretty stoked on it. And yeah, I think that the more that you understand the environment and even how trails work, and the effort that goes into building trails and the whole sort of wider world outside the mountain bike community, I think it can only enhance people's riding experience. Yeah, it can't be a bad thing knowing about how the world works, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Douglas, thanks so much for talking with us and sharing your research. I learned a ton, and I'm sure our listeners will as well. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that's all we've got this week. We'll talk to you again next week.